Good evening and welcome to this evening's discussion, Democracy, Do We Have It? Brought to you by Melbourne Conversations, the City of Melbourne's free program of talks, and by Future Leaders. I'm Peter Mayers. I present The National Interest, a program dealing with public policy issues that can be heard every Friday evening and every Sunday lunchtime on ABC Radio National. I'm very pleased to have been asked to moderate this evening's discussion. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Kulin Nations, this place now known to us as Melbourne, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. Tonight's event is being filmed and recorded for possible use on television and radio. There will be plenty of time for discussion and questions later on, but I'd ask that you restrict your comments to brief questions so that more people have an opportunity to have their say. I also want to draw your attention to the survey on the back of the program on your seats, the survey here, and to encourage you to fill that in. It's a way of adding your email address to the list of invitees for future events for Melbourne Conversations, and also a way of giving feedback to the organisers so they can improve the program. We have four eminent speakers for you this evening: the Honourable Justice Lasry, Judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria; Mr John Hartigan, Chairman and CEO of News Limited; Ms Claudette Werleigh, the Secretary-General of Pax Christi International and former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Haiti; and Mr Ronald Wright, award-winning Canadian writer and historian. And the question they'll address this evening is, democracy, do we have it? The obvious answer to that question is yes. At least here in Australia we have periodic elections, universal adult franchise, we have regular changes of government, we have a clear separation between the executive, the legislature and the judiciary, and we have independent media outlets. But that doesn't mean you can all go home now without hearing from our speakers, because it's obvious, for one thing, that our democracy doesn't function as well as it might. Just last Friday on The National Interest, for example, I interviewed the immediate past President and current Deputy President of the Senate, Liberal South Australian Senator Alan Ferguson, who told me that question time is a farce in federal parliament. We've become inured to question time as light entertainment, a kind of gladiatorial contest which is all about form and not at all about substance. And that may seem a trivial matter, but when you step back and think about it, as Senator Ferguson has done, and remember that question time is supposed to be the point at which ministers are held to account, where government actions are submitted to scrutiny, well then the farcical nature of question time in Australia constitutes a serious deficiency in the functioning of our democracy. And certainly at an international level we can see that democracy is lacking, that smaller states, or perhaps more accurately poorer states, are generally overruled by the more powerful, that might is often right even when it's wrong. On the other hand, you could mount an argument that we have too much democracy, particularly in this era of ecological crisis when we need resolute and determined leadership, willing to take unpopular decisions rather than nervous governments who can't see past the horizon of a 3 or 4 year electoral cycle. So the question might be rephrased as, is our democracy adequate? Is it up to the challenge? And how could we do things better? Our first speaker this evening is the Honourable Justice Lasry, Judge of the Supreme Court of Victoria. As a Queen's Counsel before his recent elevation to the bench, Justice Lasry was involved in several of the most important legal cases in recent Australian history, both here and overseas, many of which touched on questions of fundamental rights, including, for example, as junior counsel assisting the coroner inquiring into 8 fatal police shootings here in Victoria in the late 80s, as defence counsel for Jack Thomas in his terrorism trial and subsequent appeal, as a member of the Australian Defence Team for Van Nguyen, who was charged with drug trafficking in Singapore, Peter Halloran, a Victorian police officer charged with sex offences in Sierra Leone, and Muran Sukumaran and Michael Chan in the Bali 9 case. Justice Lasry was also an independent observer for the Law Council of Australia at the trial of David Hicks in Guantanamo Bay. Please welcome Justice Lasry.
Thank you, Peter, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In his introduction, Peter has effectively put my case, so If you don't mind, I might just go home now and hand over to the next speaker. Because I've come here to say that the answer to the question, democracy, do we have it, is of course yes. And we, I've assumed, means us in Melbourne, Australia, or in Australia, rather than mankind generally. Inevitably, we look internationally for a contrast. If people think of democracy as a form of government in which people have a voice in the exercise of power, typically through elected political representatives, then that's what we've got. And the roots of the word democracy, of course, combine the words people and power. The election of government, of course, is not the complete package, and you might think that I would say that because the third arm of government, the judiciary, is not elected. And that's the section of which I'm a member. But the clear answer is yes, we do have democracy here in Australia. The answer is in part qualitative, and Peter has touched on that to some extent during the course of his introduction, as well as comparative. We know we've got democracy here in Australia because we can measure it, we can observe it, and by and large we like it. We don't think we like it, but we do. Of course, democracy didn't always impress everyone. The great Orson Welles said the following: in Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, bloodshed. They produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. What we make of our democracy is, of course, comparative, but it takes no time at all to think of the places that don't have it. Our democracy is, clearly enough, the capitalist model. There may be some others, but ours is clearly the capitalist model. The real cynics would say that living in a democracy is the freedom to buy a big house you can't afford, with money you don't have, to impress people you wish were dead. And unlike communism, democracy doesn't mean having just one ineffective political party, it means having two ineffective political parties. And it also means, these cynics would say, that with proper timing and scrupulous bookkeeping, anyone can die owing the government a huge amount of money. So why am I so confident about our democracy? And the answer is because there are three fundamental aspects to our democracy which are probably best in evidence in Australia, as much as anywhere else in the world. The first, of course, is that we vote at every level of government, and on no occasion when we vote do we encounter guns or the military at the polling booth. The second, and I think important reason, and Peter referred in his introduction to the independent media, is that we can laugh at our politicians, we can mock them, and when we do so, we live to tell the tale, or to retell the joke. And of course, in many parts of the world, that freedom is not always so clear. Where countries are controlled by military governments, little interested in being criticised and mocked. So that when Jay Leno said recently, for example, in relation to President Bush, his approval rating has dropped so low now that the only thing he's above is the law, people were able to laugh. And Jay Leno would have a job on the following day and wouldn't be in custody. It is, I think, that kind of television comedy that perhaps didn't appeal to Shimon Peres, who said in 1995, television has made dictatorship impossible, but it's made democracy unbearable. In my opinion, though, the freedom to be critical and the freedom to humorise our politicians without fear of reprisal is an important part of the guarantee that our democracy is intact. It is true that there are aspects to the machinery of government, and indeed there are aspects to the machinery of each part of the government, which are open to criticism. The criticism itself, the very kind of criticism that Peter referred to a little earlier about question time in the Parliament, is the very thing, the fact of it is the very thing that demonstrates that our democracy is healthy. It may not be perfect, but it's healthy. The other element, in my opinion, which is very important and perhaps in many respects in the hustle and bustle of political debate and the running of governments, doesn't perhaps get the attention and understanding that it deserves, is the operation of the judiciary as a third arm of government. Because what the judiciary does effectively is to protect the rule of law. And it's important to understand that in this country, in the United Kingdom and in the United States, over a long period of time, but particularly recently, independent and impartial courts have imposed limits on the activity of executive government in order to preserve the rule of law. So when you're asking yourselves whether we have a democracy, ask whether citizens in our community are vulnerable to the arbitrary exercise of state power. Some people would say that some people are, but the reason that by and large the answer to that question is no is because we have genuinely an independent and impartial judiciary. The contribution that the courts make to democracy has recently been outlined by the Victorian Chief Justice Marilyn Warren in her Deakin Law oration on the 20th of August 2008. I commend it to you if you get an opportunity to read it. In that speech, she underlines the importance of an impartial application of the rule of law to maintaining a democracy. She refers particularly to the non-political role of the judiciary and gives the example of what occurred in Pakistan in 2007, when after the Supreme Court issued an order against the Pakistani president's actions in suspending the constitution and declaring a state of emergency, the army entered the court and removed the Chief Justice and many other judges. They were actually detained until relatively recently. The great thing about the Victorian Supreme Court is that if the army ever attempted to enter that building to remove us, they'd be lost within 5 minutes and we'd be safe for hours. Importantly, Chief Justice Warren reminded us in that lecture, and this was really the point of the speech that she was making, that the fact that judges are not elected does not mean that there is an undemocratic element to our system of governance. The contribution to democracy, she asserts, and I agree with respect, is to be found in their independence and their impartiality in order to interpret the law and protect the rule of law. It is in fact the judge's freedom from the political process that enables that to occur. What judges do is permanently on display, a matter of public record. On this very day, probably the most serious sentence for murder, certainly this year and in recent years, has been imposed by a judge of the court of which I'm a member. You can, tonight, listen to the audio of that sentence. You can read the reasons the judge gave for the sentence that he imposed. And you can do that in respect of every decision made by the courts. There are many other countries where that freedom and that independence and that impartiality doesn't exist or is substantially diminished. And it is that diminution of judicial independence that corrupts the rule of law. And every time, I must say, that I went to any of the places where I think that's the case, I always came home very much relieved that we have a very adequate system here in Australia. In West Africa and Sierra Leone, like a lot of countries in that region, there is substantial corruption. The effectiveness of the judiciary is undermined by that. In Singapore, the final decision as to whether an individual lives or dies is no longer left to the court, but is made by the executive. A decision is made which is untestable and unreviewable. And regrettably, our great ally, the United States, saw fit to set up a system of criminal justice, quote unquote, at the military commissions at Guantanamo Bay, which completely lacked any genuine judicial independence. So the answer is yes, ladies and gentlemen, we do have a democracy. It may not be perfect, but we do have a democracy. We have a genuine and non-coerced role in the selection of governments. Having elected them, we can laugh at them. And when the executive power strains the limits, we have a genuine, independent and impartial judiciary to protect the rule of law. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the Honourable Justice Lex Lasry. Our second speaker this evening is Mr John Hartigan, the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of News Limited. Now, I need hardly remind you that News Limited is Australia's largest media company, the nation's biggest publisher of newspapers, with significant interests also in online publishing, magazines and subscription TV. John Hartigan began his career as a cadet at John Fairfax and Sons and joined News in 1970 via the Daily Mirror, and he still regards himself very much as a journalist at heart. Few journalists, though, have quite his influence. Mr Hartigan sat on the Independent Steering Committee for the 2020 Summit earlier this year. He co-chaired the stream of that summit dealing with the future of Australian governance, and in the same month he was invited to join a new business advisory group to advise the government as it prepares new workplace laws. In 2007, John Hartigan led the formation of the media coalition Australia's Right to Know, which is campaigning, the ABC's involved, Fairfax is involved, all the major media organisations, campaigning for improvements in free speech and particularly the freedom of information laws in Australia. Also in 2007, he delivered the ABC's Andrew Wright lecture to significant acclaim, having argued that the social value and public importance of quality journalism had never been greater than it is today in Australia. But I think he's most proud recently of being invited 3 years ago, the first businessman to do so, being invited to deliver the Reconciliation Australia annual lecture. Please welcome John Hartigan.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. By and large, that we regard ourselves as living in a free country. In many respects, this is true. We enjoy freedom of speech, freedom of civic association, and so on. As Australians, we take great pride in being free to speak our minds, to tell it as it is. We regard Australia as having a free press. In fact, some might say the media has too much freedom. But the freedom of our press reflects our own freedoms. It is something that we shouldn't take for granted. My simple warning to you is this: don't. Not because we face some far-off threat, because the threats to our freedom are already with us. They affect us every day. My comments on democratic freedom are through the prism of the media. It is through the media that most Australians are kept informed about the things that affect them, such as how we are governed, how our taxes are spent, how justice is done and seen to be done, and so on. Across Australia, there are now some 500 different secrecy provisions in various pieces of legislation that restrict what you and I are allowed to know. In the next few minutes, I want to talk about a number of areas in which our right to know has been severely restricted over the past couple of decades in a period of encroaching secrecy and censorship. First of all, I'd like to deal with freedom of information. We are told by our governments that the vast majority of requests for information are met. In Victoria, in fact, I'm told the figure is some 97%. Like the promise that your margarine is 97% fat-free, it's really the 3% that's important. The 97% refers to all those thousands of requests from private citizens for pretty basic information. The 3% refers to information about government policy and decisions that politicians don't want us to know about. Like the fact that a $6 million bonus was to be paid to the private operator of Victoria's speed cameras once a certain number of fines were paid by you, the motorists of this state. That information took a lot of effort to extract from the government. A lot of information is kept secret on some flimsy basis or another, such as Which schools have the best or worst records of academic performance or violence? The bonuses that are paid to senior public servants? How much government money is paid to unions? The state's 20 most dangerous intersections? Which pubs and clubs have the highest incidence of assault? Which childcare centres have been served warning notices? Details about contracts between governments and private third-party contractors. Which restaurants have been prosecuted or warned for health breaches? Waiting lists at hospitals, even the result of public opinion surveys on things such as workplace laws. It goes on and on. If the media can't get hold of this kind of information, chances are you can't know about it. The federal and state governments, and I mean every state governments, are guilty, as are local councils and both sides of politics. Freedom of information is too often an oxymoron. We have a right to know how we are governed, how and why decisions are made, where our taxes are going. Here in Victoria, we were stopped from identifying a major public figure accused of fraudulent company dealings. Then the court imposed another order to prevent us from telling you we had been gagged. To get the information that really matters, you need to be very patient and have very deep pockets. We took one case involving the former Treasurer, Peter Costello, all the way to the High Court. It took several years, we lost, and it cost us over $500,000. In another case, we fought a long battle to get hold of an auditor's report on travel expenses by MPs before the request was finally granted. Then we were quoted $1 million in fees to compile that report. The information that's hardest to get is the stuff that's most likely to embarrass those in power. The situation is a national priority that warrants your concern and attention. In 1976, prior to the introduction of freedom of information laws, Prime Minister Fraser said, "If the Australian electorate is to make valid judgments on government policy, it should have the greatest access to information possible. How can any community progress without continuing an informed and intelligent debate? How can there be debate without information?" 32 years later, we are still waiting for that promise to become a reality. Now I would like to talk about privacy. The Australian Law Reform Commission has just released a submission, weighing in, I kid you not, at just under 5 kilos. It proposes a new statutory right of privacy that would allow innocent citizens to sue the media for breaches of privacy. So far, so good. We're all entitled to privacy about our personal lives, such as information about our health, the taxes we pay, and so on. If there is no legitimate public interest in a private individual affairs, then that information should remain private. But this new law would be irrelevant to innocent citizens to whom the media has no interest. Nor would it benefit those who have neither the time nor the money or the perseverance to pursue litigation. It would be open to abuse by irresponsible claimants who could clog our already overburdened courts. Such a law would simply allow rich people to employ lawyers in a bid to avoid scrutiny for their wrongdoing. Such a law would protect people like Christopher Skase, Alan Bond, Renee Rivkin, Graham Richardson and others. The list goes on. Where is the public interest in that? The next area I want to look at is the suppression of information by courts. Using various statutes, judges can suppress certain information about a case if they believe that its disclosure could prejudice the rights of the plaintiff. Some of these restrictions are legitimate, such as an order that prevents the naming of sexual assault victims, children or juveniles, or an order that is genuinely deemed to protect us from a national threat to security or public safety. But many suppression orders are not legitimate, such as an order suppressing the name of a well-known director of a public company who put prostitution services on his corporate credit card, and an order which meant it was 2 years before the media could report that gangland killer Carl Williams was found guilty of murder, or the suppression of a witness's name in a terrorism trial, though his identity and his evidence were already in the public domain. 10 years ago, there were about 100 suppression orders in place around Australia. Today, there are more than 1,000. These orders often apply in one state, but not in others. If you rely on the borderless world of the internet for news, information suppressed in one state amounts to a blanket national gag in any case. Justice conducted behind closed doors is not justice. You only have to look at the case involving Mohammed Hanif to know that justice must not only be seen to be done, but must be done, but also seen to be done. I apologise. In his case, neither appears to have happened. The price for democracy can be very high. For individuals like Hanif, it is even higher. The integrity and independence of the courts can only be upheld when they are open to full scrutiny by us all. More and more whistleblowers are ending up in court. Whistleblowers are often public servants. They turn to the media, usually as a last resort, having exhausted internal channels that have ignored their concerns about corruption, maladministration, or abuse of power within government or the bureaucracy. But when they blow the whistle, they are usually committing a crime under the Crimes Act. They are increasingly hunted down by the federal or state-based integrity commissions and are charged. They can lose their life savings of superannuation defending themselves. They almost always lose their job and are silently ostracised and victimised in their workplace. Their career is effectively over. They face heavy penalties, if not jail. The threat of jail is real. And all of this happens regardless of whether they are acting in the public interest or whether or not their suspicions turn out to be right. Alan Kessing was a customs officer who denies leaking information about lax security at Australian airports, which made the country vulnerable to terrorism. His internal report was ignored for 2 years. After the Australian newspaper uncovered them, the federal government stepped in with $200 million to fix the security problems. Kessing was charged and with leaking the information to the newspaper, convicted and sentenced to 9 months in jail, later suspended when he put up $1,000 as a good behaviour bond. He is now fighting an appeal with what's left of his life savings. Journalists can face the same problems as whistleblowers. Here in Victoria, a public servant, Desmond Kelly, was charged and convicted for leaking information to 2 journalists for a plan by the federal government to deny entitlements to war veterans. His conviction was later quashed on appeal. During the case, journalists Michael Harvey and Jared McManus from the Herald Sun refused to disclose their source. They were convicted of contempt of court. They were spared jail, but were fined $7,000 each and now have criminal records. Their story was 100% right. Its disclosure was in the public interest. In Western Australia, this year alone, 6 journalists have been hauled before the state's Crime and Corruption Commission and asked to reveal their sources. In Western Australia, you commit a crime if you tell anyone, including your spouse or your employer, that you have been interviewed by the Commission. In Queensland, the Parliament has just passed legislation that will compel journalists to disclose the sources or face jail if they refuse to do so. There is no legal basis on which journalists could refuse and avoid prosecution. I ask you, if you are a public servant, how likely you are to come forward, even if the information you have is right and the public has a right to know what it is. It is no coincidence that the more embarrassing information might be political, the hotter the pursuit by the police to track down and punish the whistleblower and the journalist who publish their concerns. Instead of arresting, charging and convicting whistleblowers, we should be celebrating their courage. The public interest rests with the public, not the politicians and not the police. So the question for us tonight, democracy, do we have it? I believe we do. But like most things, it's imperfect. Like all things of great value, we need to cherish it, nurture it, and protect it. In a mature democracy, we should have a say in who governs us and a right to know how they govern us. We can only participate effectively in that democracy if we have the information that allows us to make informed choices. My proposition to you is that our democracy needs a lot of work on all fronts that I've covered this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, John Hartigan, CEO and Chairman of News Limited. We now move to a more international perspective with Ms. Claudette Werleigh, Secretary-General of the Catholic peace organisation Pax Christi International. In Australia, Pax Christi is an ecumenical organisation with other Christian churches as members, and we're grateful to Pax Christi Australia for bringing Ms. Werleigh to Australia. As a former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Haiti, Claudette Werleigh is ideally placed to address the topic of democracy. Prior to joining Pax Christi, she was Director of the Conflict Transformation Program at the Life and Peace Institute in Uppsala, Sweden, for 8 years. And there she led field activities aimed at strengthening peace building in war-torn societies in the Horn of Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Congo-Brazzaville. Please welcome Ms. Claudette Werleigh.
Good evening, everyone. Democracy, do we have it? Certainly, I will not be talking about here. If democracy is the government by the people, with the people, and for the people, I am beginning to think that it's not only in my country that there's no democracy, but in several countries in the world, including those that are the champion of democracy. And I am saying that because a few years ago, before the war on Iraq, I have seen thousands and thousands and thousands and millions of people going out and saying no to the war. In spite of that, the leaders of the world went to the war. So in that sense, I'm sure that it's not the will of the people that is leading some of our leaders. But I will talk about Haiti. And unfortunately, this is my country. I can say that this is very clear that we do not know, we do not experience, we do not have total democracy. But that doesn't mean that the people of Haiti are not trying to work or to have democracy in the country. At the contrary, a lot of people, including some of my friends, have died for that big ideal. And I will give you just a few examples. In democracy, one person has one vote. In a country like Haiti, where the difference between the minority who has access to political power, economical power, and also has access to education. So that means that there is really a gap with the majority of people who do not have access to all the services or those powers. In 1990, people in Haiti have worked hard to try to go through elections because we were told, and we are continuing to be told, that elections, it is a road to democracy. And I think that people were very happy and very proud to see that they have been really non-violently, they went to vote and they vote for their leaders. But what happened when the person that you vote for is not the person chosen by the armed force, for example, and you do not have the backup of United States of America, which is the leader country in our zone. Jean-Bertin Aristide at that time, even though he was voted by 63.7% of the population of Haiti, 7 months later, he was overhauled by a coup d'etat. Media is another way to achieve democracy, because then you can bring the news to the people. Even during the time of the dictatorship, we have had someone, a very close friend of mine, Jean L. Dominique. He has learned to tell us what was going on and to stand by the truth, and he was a leader of democracy in Haiti. On the 3rd of April in 2000, he has been killed. When he was killed, for us, it was really a blow to democracy. Jean-L. Dominique used to tell us that the media is like a barometer or a thermometer for democracy. A lot of people tend to crush the thermometer, but if you have a fever, even if you throw away your thermometer, that doesn't mean that you solve the problem. He has been killed, and for the funerals, not only the president at that time cried, but we had to have a big celebration in the stadium for him, because it was the only place who could contain all the people who wanted to pay respect to him. We are learning, and we are trying to build up democracy. When, in 1991, we voted for our people in the parliament, people in Haiti, members of the civil society, ordinary citizens, continued, to have their voice and wanted to have their voice heard. At that time, we were told that we have to be very careful. When you have a parliament, it's not a matter to have participatory democracy. We were supposed to have representative democracy. And at that time, we were told that once we had already elected our members of the parliament, then it is as if there was nothing for the ordinary citizen to do. But what happens when ordinary citizens do not look after the members of the parliament start going their own way, and they do not listen to the people any longer. More recently, the President of the Republic, Rodé Préval, has tried one time after the other to present a new prime minister, because in my country, the president suggests a prime minister. He has to do it in consultation with the president of the Senate and the president of the parliament. Then started a power struggle between the parliament and the presidency, because what happened is the member of the parliament wanted to make sure that they would have the members of their party as Minister of Finance, of Minister of Foreign Affairs, and so on. Those are negative examples to tell you that the road for democracy is very long, it is very difficult, but even though it takes a long time, but I am sure that sometime we will make it because at least people know, where they want to go. But I would not want to finish up without giving some positive example where I believe some countries where there is not yet a democracy, I think that people are trying, to set up some democratic way to rule the country. My first example would be from Congo, the Republic of Congo, Congo-Brazzaville. And it has to do with the media. Media in that country started to get along together. First, to get trained, to have common seminar. It started with an initiative of the media of the Catholic Church, joined by the media of the Protestant Church, and soon enough, they had all the media of the country working together, and they themselves decided upon a code of conduct. The country had gone through war several times. They know that they had been manipulated by politicians, and they know that the media had also played a role. So the media of the different organizations decided that they were going to go by a code of conduct that they themselves had agreed upon, and later on they created a body, an institution to monitor what was going on. This is still going on now, and I know that step by step, people have been going the right way. For example, the media now are working on transparency, working with the group of people of Publish What You Pay. The government of Brazzaville, of Congo, has to publish, what it receives for the price of oil, so ordinary citizens would know at least how much money they have. So media can play a role to help people know what's going on and also monitor themselves. And finally, I would give another example where in the same country, someone who was working as a human rights activist has been appointed as the public prosecutor. What he did was, helped by one organization, was to make sure that there was one number where the public prosecutor could be reached by the people every time that people in the service, let's say public servants, or members of the army, or policemen, were trespassing the rights and making abuse to the population. They can either put a note, let's say in some public boxes that are there for that, or just call a number, then it goes to the public prosecutor, and at least they send people to investigate what is going on. Once I gave that example, and people asked me, yes, but people could use that, against some people that they do not like, that they have problems with. There has been a lot of sensibilization or before they started with that. There have been a lot of seminar, a lot of training in the population. And I think it is one way to go further, because people are collaborating at the grassroots level with NGO working on human rights organization. The municipalities are involved, and the public justice system is involved. This is one way for me, in my view, to, let's say, step by step to build up democracy. I will stop now with my example. We may come back to that later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Claudette Werleigh, the Secretary-General of Pax Christi International. Our fourth and final speaker is award-winning Canadian novelist, historian and essayist Ronald Wright, fresh from the Brisbane Writers' Festival. Ronald Wright is the author of 9 books, including A Short History of Progress, which was based on his 2004 Massey Lectures for the CBC, Canada's equivalent of our own Boyer Lectures, and the Massey Lectures are also broadcast here in Australia on ABC Radio National each year. A Short History of Progress won the CBA Libris Award for Non-Fiction Book of the Year and has been published worldwide now in more than a dozen languages. Ronald Wright's most recent book, however, hot off the presses, is What is America? A Short History of the New World Order. And please welcome Ronald Wright to speak to us about democracy.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. It's a great pleasure to be here in Australia and an honour to be here in such distinguished company. I've been asked to speak about democracy and the role of the United States, the influence of the United States and democracy around the world. Well, that's a big subject. So I've got my watch here to keep an eye on things, and I thought probably the best thing to do would be to read some germane passages from my new book. The United States, of course, has always seen itself as the city on the hill, the beacon of democracy. In the book, I suggest that the United States actually has 2 very different and somewhat incompatible founding traditions, which have come into sharp focus in the present electoral campaign. On the one hand is the project of the Puritans, which was to found what they called a new commonwealth, which essentially was they were the losing side in the English Civil War, and their idea was to found a theocratic republic, or a series of theocratic republics, which is what the name Commonwealth meant at that time, in the New World. And they were seeing their project very much through the lens of the Old Testament, the idea of modern-day saints, as they called themselves, migrating to a promised land and trying to build there a heaven on earth. And the other tradition is that of the founding fathers, the great 18th century Enlightenment intellectuals, such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who also saw America as a beacon of democracy and as a promised land, but it was more of a secular vision of founding a secular utopia. And perhaps, I think both had the idea that this ideal could be exported around the world. I'll just read you a little quote, and I think both the Puritan side has perhaps never acknowledged that their promised land was taken at the cost of the people who were already there, and that their little democracies only operated for people who were of exactly the same religious beliefs. There were wars between the different sects, Quakers were hanged by other Puritans, and so forth. And that's never been really acknowledged by them. But Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that all men are created equal, was very much aware of the moral contradiction of writing those words in a country that owned slaves. And he himself, at the time, was a slave owner. But he did have the courage to write an essay on slavery in Virginia, in which he said, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just." He said that in 1784. Just over 200 years later, when the United States, a United States warship accidentally shot down an Iranian airliner, thinking it was a jet fighter, and killing nearly 300 people, all the people on board. A terrible incident. And George H. Bush, father of the present president, said this: "I never apologize for the United States of America. I don't care what the facts are." I think in most democracies, a statement like that would have sunk a politician's career. But in the United States, 4 months after he said that, George H. Bush was elected president. We are all Americans now. The front page of Le Monde cried in sympathy in September 2001 after airliners became missiles over New York and Washington. Besides solidarity and outrage, that headline held a broader truth, intended or not, that has been slowly dawning for the past 100 years. Through military might, big business, popular culture, covert operations, and above all through social example and the shining promise of modernity, the United States has Americanized the world. Well, this process was just beginning when President Woodrow Wilson idealistically called for a new world order after the First World War. I think a lot of people think that President George H. Bush coined that term, but it was Woodrow Wilson more than 70 years earlier. And at that time, the phrase had nothing to do with an imperial order, quite the reverse. Wilson was promoting his plan for a League of Nations, an international body that would safeguard each country's sovereignty and settle disputes by arbitration. More than 10 million people had died in 4 years of slaughter, set off by a terrorist attack, the shooting of the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary by a Serbian extremist. Or rather, the war had begun with the reaction to that attack, the invasion of a small country that had not sponsored the terrorism by an empire thirsting for revenge. The United States never did join the League of Nations. Not enough of Wilson's countrymen shared his ideals. And it would take another great war before Europe learned the lessons of its past. The phrase New World Order was not much heard again until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, leaving one nation mightier than all others. I think it's important to note that Franklin Roosevelt, president during the 1930s and throughout the Second World War until his death towards the end of that war, built on this Wilsonian ideal of exporting democracy and founding a just international order by sponsoring the United Nations, the successor to the League of Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and various other bodies. And the idea was, I think the lessons of the two world wars were that if we don't want terrible wars, Bolshevik revolution, Nazi revolution, Great Depressions, you just can't have huge gaps between rich and poor. You cannot have mass unemployment, and you cannot have some people getting obscenely rich while other parts of the world starve. That was the lesson of the first half of the 20th century, learned at a cost of 80 million lives. But the sad thing is that the United States seems to have forgotten that lesson recently, although the Europeans, after trying to kill each other twice in a very short order, seem to be learning it. An ironic reversal of Wilson's internationalism came in 2002 when President George W. Bush did all he could to sabotage the founding of the International Criminal Court. Bush feared that American nationals might be brought to book overseas, a realistic worry given that his administration was breaking international law on the treatment of war prisoners. And in March 2008, with only months left in office, he vetoed a congressional bill that would have stopped American interrogators from torturing their suspects. The United States is now the world's lone superpower, a successor to Britain, Spain, and ancient Rome, an empire whose deeds could make or break this new century. Both within and beyond America, people are asking themselves what sort of imperium this might be. Will the new Rome, like the old, see its democracy wither as its power grows? Will it be ruled by a Senate, a Caesar, or a Nero? Will its dominion be benign and inclusive, offering benefits as well as duties to its subjects? Or will it be a rapacious overlordship, a robber empire extorting tribute and obedience, like the unloved reign of the Aztecs, or the client state networks of both Cold War superpowers at their worst? After the flawed presidential election of 2000, the new Bush regime took the United States further to the political right than any major Western country since 1945, a shift that began before the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Washington's reaction to that tragedy, trampling its own constitution and the Geneva Conventions in an unjust war on terror, has squandered solidarity at home and goodwill abroad, provoking a re-examination of the nation's essence. Is America what it thinks it is? Is America what the world has long believed it to be? In a recent opinion poll taken by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, that was earlier this year, 52% of those polled chose the United States as, quote, the country that stands out as a negative force in the world, end quote. That was the top choice, 52%. The second choice, Iran, came in at 21%. It is likely that a similar poll taken in Europe, Australia, or Latin America would yield similar results. American prestige has never been lower. Yet, whether we like it or not, the United States is such a military and economic power that what it does is everyone's business. Well, I shall end there, and I think that paradox has made itself very apparent in the present electoral campaigns in the United States.